Hello and welcome to our lecture on commerce, federalism, and the case Gibbons v. Ogden. I will not sugarcoat it for you. This is a very complex area of law, and it's complex because it spans the entire history of the nation. The Supreme Court's treatment of the interstate commerce power, the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce, develops over time as a result of our changing economy, and also because of political conflicts over the power of the state and a desire to preserve individual rights to transact. So this is very complex and we have a lot of work to do, so let's get to it. Commerce and federalism are very closely related. In fact, much of what we may have discussed about federalism involves commercial transaction. So you should note that they are both questions about limits on federal power. Federalism, of course, we said is about assigning powers to levels of government. The Commerce Clause is an attempt to place limits on the power of the federal government, but also allow it the power to regulate interstate markets for the good of the nation. Federalism is about the tension between the states and the federal governments when they come into conflict. It's about those conflicts are often about which governmental entity should regulate certain area of life, the states or the federal government. The commerce power is about limits on an explicit federal power. So Commerce Clause jurisprudence and the court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause is about limits on an explicitly granted federal power. So let me just give you a brief overview of commerce. There are two major sources of federal power when it comes to regulating commerce. The first is the federal government's ability to tax, the Tax and Spend Clause, and the other is the Interstate Commerce Clause. These two together provide the federal government the power to regulate markets and to create revenue for itself and then to spend that revenue to achieve various goals. Interstate commerce is, as it says here, incredibly important to our lives. It affects everything, and that was the problem initially, that as our interstate economy grew after the Civil War, as our economy transitioned from primarily intrastate to interstate in nature, it did affect everything, and the court was very concerned that this meant that the state's power to regulate local aspects of life would go away. And so much of what we see happening in the area of Commerce Clause jurisprudence involves the court's attempt to preserve the power of the states in the federal system. In terms of the historical context of the Commerce Clause, economic hardships were the genesis really for getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and holding a constitutional convention, making revisions to the Articles. And because the Commerce Clause was so desperately needed, there was little controversy over whether it should be in the Constitution. It passed easily, but it became a major source of contention throughout the early days of the Republic and through even to today. Article 1, Section 8 is where we find the Commerce Clause, and it includes very simple language, but as it says here on the screen, it's very deceptive. The Commerce Clause states that the United States government will have the power to regulate commerce among the states, but it doesn't define what is commerce. So one of the first things the court has to do is define what commerce is. Furthermore, by not defining commerce, the Commerce Clause does not draw this line between state and federal power. And we're going to see that there were many conflicts over whether a thing that the federal government was attempting to regulate was actually commerce. And there's also no other provision that fleshes out the Commerce Clause, no other provision that gives it life or meaning and would allow the court to engage in more of a structural analysis or any other kind of analysis with respect to the Commerce Clause. Here are some keys to understanding commerce. First of all, we have to look at it historically because it's the growth of our understanding of the Commerce Clause really occurred in the crucible of all of these conflicts that occur throughout the history of the nation. And pre and post New Deal rulings are key. So as we work our way through these lectures, you'll see that we deal with the early stuff first, and then we talk about early New Deal conflicts, and then a new interpretation of the Commerce Clause post-New Deal. The very first case in which the court attempts to define what is commerce was called Gibbons versus Ogden. It was decided in 1828, and our old friend, Chief Justice John Marshall, wrote the opinion. The court considers this question: does the federal permit granted to Gibbons supersede the New York law that gives Ogden a monopoly on steamships in New York waters? So immediately we have a problem here. First of all, we have two individuals who want to operate in New York waters. Gibbons, who has a permit granted by Congress under its Coasting License Act, and then another one that was given to Ogden by the New York State Legislature, which said that he had the sole right to operate steamships in New York waters. Gibbons wanted to transport people from Elizabethtown, New Jersey to New York City. So he was crossing from one state into another. That's interstate, but is it commerce? Ogden just simply wanted to operate in New York waters. So we also have a question of supremacy here. Which one of these two permits is supposed to supersede the other? In answering this question, the majority it was a unanimous decision by the court, majority opinion written by Chief Justice Marshall, and he says that the enumeration of power over commerce, interstate commerce, means that the federal government has power over such actions that apply to the states generally. In other words, if Gibbons is involved in interstate commerce that would bring him from the territorial waters of one state, New Jersey, into the territorial waters of another, New York, Congress can regulate it, and it can regulate it to the exclusion of the states. Thus, New York may not penalize Gibbons for operating his steamships in New York waters because he's engaged in interstate commerce. Okay, Marshall first has to define what is commerce. And this is an important decision because he gives the initial meaning to commerce, and it is a meaning that is still good law. He defines commerce as traffic or transaction, and certainly it is. I mean, every time money changes hands, money is exchanged for a good or a service, that is a transaction. But he also says that commerce is something more than merely traffic or transacting. He says that it is intercourse. And by that, he means it is all the things that make transacting possible. Not simply the exchange of money for a service, but all of the things that surround and facilitate interstate commercial transaction. Then, he says, it includes navigation. Because, in fact, Gibbons is not involved in an exchange of a good for money, right? He's just simply moving people from point A to point B through navigation. But Marshall says that navigation and transportation of goods and people and in interstate commerce are so bound up with commercial transacting that those two things, navigation and transportation, are commerce. Might as well be considered commerce. As it says here, navigation and transportation are not commerce, but they are so bound up with transacting that they must be included in the meaning of the term interstate commerce. So then he has to deal with where interstate commerce occurs. Now, Ogden wanted to argue that interstate commerce only occurred between the borders of states and did not extend into the interior of states. But Marshall puts that to rest. He says any border crossing involving commercial transaction is interstate commerce. Commerce doesn't happen between states, rather it continues into a state once the border is crossed. Thus, Congress can regulate Gibbons operating in New York State territorial waters, and the New York State legislature cannot punish Gibbons for doing so, for violating its law. So the threshold question is this, and this is something very important to keep in mind throughout, because this is always the threshold question. Is it commerce? If it is, and it is interstate in character, Congress can regulate it to its fullest extent. This is something that lawyers and law school students don't understand. The threshold question is it commerce? And once you've said yes to that, you can't come back and say, but we don't want Congress to regulate that as much as it is. No. If it's commerce, if the answer to the question, is it interstate commerce, is yes, then Congress can regulate it as much or as little as it likes. Very much in character with Chief Justice Marshall, this ruling, this definition of commerce, leaves very little power reserved to the states if a thing is interstate commerce. That's very typical of Marshall's decisions. Remember, he was a Federalist. He was very much in favor of national power. Okay, that is the end of our introduction to commerce and to Gibbons versus Ogden. I'll see you in just a little while for our next lecture.